Good afternoon, good evening, and even good morning to the many people who are joining us around the world for this Zoom webinar. I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm Andrew Perchuk, the Deputy Director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program, which connects to two things very close to our heart. First, of course, the archival impulse, and then the GRI's African American Art History Initiative. I'm going to keep my remarks brief this morning, but I want to acknowledge that I am standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Now I would like to introduce Rebecca Peabody, the GRI's head of research projects and academic outreach.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to welcome you to this talk and conversation, The Archival Impulse in Contemporary Black Art. The point of departure for our conversation today is Sheree Smith's award-winning book, Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, the first in-depth examination of Charles's provocative interrogation of images of racism and the ways in which they resonate across time and across multiple viewing spaces and contexts. We'll start today with a presentation by Sheree Smith on her book, and then turn to a conversation between Smith and scholars Tiffany E. Barber and Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw, who will discuss the ways in which contemporary artists engage with archival materials within the context of African American art history, as well as its increased institutionalization. Engagement will take many forms in this conversation and will include artists who use archives in the creation of their work, artists who critique archival collections, and artists who create new archives. Along the way, the very nature of archives, what they mean, what kinds of work they do, and their relationship to Black art will be considered. Toward the end of our time, we will expand the conversation to include our audience via a question and answer session. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce all three scholars at this time, though we will be joined by Sheree Smith first, with Tiffany Barber and Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw joining a little bit later. Dr. Sheree Smith is the Joseph T. Jamail Endowed Professor in African American Studies and Chair of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is also founding executive director of the Art Galleries of Black Studies. She is the author, most recently, of Michael Ray Charles, A Retrospective, which won the Eldridge Prize in American Art from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This year, Smith is an inaugural residential scholar of the African American Art History Initiative at the Getty Research Institute. Her project, entitled Healing Old Wounds, explores how the contemporary artists Carrie Mae Weems, Charles Gaines, Rodney McMillan, and Colleen Smith use appropriation and conceptualism to explore traumatic events from the American past. Dr. Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw holds the class of 1940 Bicentennial Term Chair in the History of Art Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of numerous publications, including Seeing the Unspeakable, The Art of Kara Walker, published by Duke University Press in 2004, and First Ladies of the United States, published by Smithsonian Press in 2020. Dr. Tiffany E. Barber is a nationally and internationally recognized scholar, curator, and critic whose writing and expert commentary have appeared in top-tier academic journals, popular media outlets, and award-winning documentaries. Her work focuses on artists of the Black diaspora working in the United States and the broader Atlantic world. She is a fellow in residence at the Getty Research Institute this year, working on a project entitled Undesirability and Her Sisters, Black Women's Visual Work in the New Millennium, as part of the scholar-year theme focusing on the fragment. I'd like to thank everybody who made this program possible today, our speakers, our audience, and colleagues in programming and AV who do so much to help share this important work. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Sheree Smith.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So it's my pleasure to be here today to talk with you about the award-winning book, Michael Ray Charles, and to talk with you about my new project. But before I do that, I'd like to thank the Getty Research Institute for graciously hosting this presentation this afternoon, Rebecca for the introduction, Tisbe for organizing all of this. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues and friends, Tiffany and Gwendolyn, for participating in this talk with me. So first and foremost, I show you the cover of the book, Michael Ray Charles. It is a 4-pound big thing that also serves as a doorstop in case of emergency. It is a really beautiful book to hold in your hands and to scroll through. The University of Texas Press did just an excellent job with designing the book as well as with producing it. The book begins with an interview with Michael Ray Charles so that the artist can speak in his own words. And what you'll see is that it is a transcription of an interview that took place at the National Portrait Gallery and Smithsonian American Museums for an event, a symposium that was organized by Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw, who at that point was really interested in performance and minstrelsy. And so it was Michael Ray's and my great honor to participate in that symposium, where, by the way, Tiffany Barber was also in resident and participated in the conversation as well. The next part of the book is full plate, fantastic color images that show Charles's work from 1992 when he graduated with his MFA from the University of Houston, all the way till 2018 when the book went into publication. So again, no expense was spared on the production quality and value of the book. I highly recommend checking it out. Of course. And then the next part of the book is called A Study in Blackness and Black Identity. It is a book within a book with several sections rather than chapters that deal very specifically with iconography that Charles uses. It historicizes the artworks within the context of social history, political history, and intellectual histories. It creates popular histories and art histories. That is, it thinks through how popular culture and art histories were also dealing with the matter of stereotypes, especially in the 1990s. And it also considers the topic of censorship, which happened in the 1990s, and of course is kind of cycling back in our culture today. So what I'd also like to point out with this topic of censorship is that my speakers, my conversants today are also well-versed in these topics of censorship, especially Gwendolyn Shaw and Kara Walker's work. So that also may be a topic of conversation today. Rather than talking with you about the entire book today, what I'd like to focus on is how Charles is a maker of archives and one who, an artist who delves into popular archives and art historical archives. And so this is a figure, a small waxy figure that can fit in the palm of your hand, that he was given by one of his classmates when he was doing his MFA at the University of Houston. The anecdote goes that he got this figure, threw it into the corner of his studio, and it wasn't until months later that he came back to it and decided that it was something that he should think a bit more about. And so what I'm showing you here is proudly manufactured. It is one of, if not the very first artwork that he created as a result of this small plastic figure. And so one of the most important things that he learned from this figure is that it is totally unrealistic, that it does not portray a real person in any way, shape, or form. And it's this disconnect between the unrealism of the Black figure and the reality of Black people that is really interesting to Charles, that he will go on to explore for the rest of his career. Now, what this figure does is also encourages him to collect contemptible collectibles. And so here are two objects from Charles's archive. One is a kind of plastic board game. The other is an advertisement for an inn. And so what you see here is what might be called the Sambo figure, or even a porter. Each of them has very stereotypical visual features, especially the exaggerated opened eyes, the big lips, the big teeth, and a kind of unrealistic view of stereotypical, exaggerated view of Black people. And so in this slide, what I'm showing you is Charles's painting Bamboozled, which takes aspects of the figures that I just showed in the last slide, the big mouth, the red lips, the eye very open, and really adapts it and changes it for this new context. And so, of course, what we have in the Bamboozled painting on the right is kind of a dartboard, kind of a wheel of fortune, but at the very center of it, of course, is this Black figure who really doesn't have any of his own agency. Instead, with the kind of slot that's in the middle of its forehead, it looks in fact like a penny bank that was also popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Moving forward to show you a couple more images from Charles's collection. These surround the figure of the alligator or the crocodile. Charles is interested in this trope or story, visual story that begins in Greek and Roman times. You see them in murals, for example, and on pots. But it comes across the Atlantic sometime maybe in the 19th century, and it is picked up by a kind of white supremacist popular culture that makes a show of thinking that it's funny for alligators to eat Black people. And what I might be able to show you here is that in these figures here, these are pencils. These are heads of Black figures that are fed into the mouths of these alligators. And so Charles also makes work that is dependent on these stereotypes, but with a difference. So changing the scale, changing the color, the shape, and even the kind of power relations between these figures. One last series of stereotypes that can be found within Michael Ray Charles's collection of contemptible collectibles surrounds the mammy figure. And this is a burlap sack on the left, and kind of cast iron figures on the right in various shapes. And in these slides, again, there is a reworking of the slide, a reworking of the visual icon of the mammy figure that Charles does to think differently about the figure of the Black woman versus, or actual Black women versus the figure of the mammy. So I'm going to move forward here and talk with you really briefly about my current project, which is called Healing Old Wounds. It is the work I am doing here at the Getty in that round building that you can see in the slide on the right. So in 1995, Carrie Mae Weems did an installation for the Getty before it became the Getty Center. That installation was called Carrie Mae Weems Reacts to Hidden Witness, which was another exhibition held at the very same time. And Hidden Witness was an exhibition that focused on 19th century cased photographs for the most part. So we're talking early photographic images of Black people, both formerly enslaved and free Black people. And so Weems is invited to create an installation in response to and reaction to these historic images. So what she does is to create these works where she goes deep into the archives of many institutions, the Getty, the Peabody Museum, among them. She enlarges the images, she colors them red, and then she puts text across the top of the images. You can't read it here, but here is where the text appears, for example. And so these are images, works from Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, which is also the installation Carrie Mae Weems Reacts. So the images on the left, which are titled You Became a Scientific Profile, an Anthropological Debate, a Negroid Type, a Photographic Subject. All of those are daguerreotypes from the Peabody collection that were taken by the photographer J.T. Zealy in South Carolina in the 1850s. Weems photographs those daguerreotypes, she enlarges them, and these are the works she creates from them. In the center image, You Became an Accomplice, is a 1956 photograph by Roger Berson, or Roger Berson, who took this photograph of Josephine Baker in her last performance, and all of the audience is cropped out of it. And then finally, I am showing you an image from Gary Winogrand's work, body of work from the 1960s. And again, the image has been enlarged with other figures cropped out. Now, this is a strategy of looking at archival works and or taking works, ready-made objects, I should say, and incorporating them into her work that Weems has done for a good deal of her career. And so here's an earlier example, an example that happens before from Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. And here she has photographed ready-made objects, a book, an Akuaba figure, a typewriter, and she has incorporated text here to take these objects from everyday popular culture, everyday archive, quotidian archive, we might call it, and put different meanings on them. And in this case, she is putting kind of radical associations with them to think through how we might effort toward racial justice. And then the last set of images that I will show you here is Weems's Making History Morning, which is a photograph of a performance that then mimics and or enacts an event that happened in 1968. And of course, the photograph that Weems is meditating on, that she is taking from the archive, is a photograph that was made by Moneta Sleep Jr., who was a staff photographer for Ebony magazine for about 40 years. So the image on the right is his image of Coretta Scott King and Bernice King during the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. from 1968. And so what Weems is doing here is not recreating the photograph identically. She is reenacting it. She is remaking it with a difference. And in fact, she's having us as viewers think about all the apparatus that goes into the making of photographs like this and how we can think through memory. And so as I conclude my presentation here, I would just like to kind of point out a few ways that artists use archives as I've kind of presented them here this afternoon. So artists like Weems and like Charles intervene in the ways that museums and archives categorize objects and people. They kind of challenge the hierarchies, low art versus high art, Black versus white, all kinds of hierarchies that exist within our culture and within museums and archives. And they also question ownership. One of the important things that Weems does, and from here I saw what happened and I cried, is to question whether it's okay to own objects of Black people, to own objects of formerly enslaved people, for example. Now, the other things that artists like Charles and Weems do in intervening in archives and using archives is to establish their own sense of belonging within the history of art and within archives. And they also exert their agency and ownership over these materials by both using archival materials that exist in places like the Research Institute or the Peabody Museum, but also in the creation of their own archives that then become fodder for their work in various ways, shapes, and forms. So I am going to stop my presentation here. I am going to hand it over to Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw, and she will hand it over to Tiffany, and then we will have a conversation.
Thanks, Cherise. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So I wanted to begin my part of the conversation by thinking about Camille Billups and James B. Hatch and their archival collections. And you can see a list of where their archives are located. They're a couple an interracial couple who met in the 1960s. He was involved in film, she was a visual artist, and they were both interested in the theater. James Hatch was a theater director as well as a filmmaker, and together they created this massive archive of objects that related to Black history on a lot of different levels, but also the kind of contemptible, collectible imagery that Cherise has just described. The next slide, please. And this led into work that that Billups did herself, including lithographs like this untitled one, Mammy's Little Coal Black Rose is the subtitle for it. And then this is the poster for the KKK Boutique, which was a film that that they did together. It's kind of sort of like a mockumentary in the spirit of Spinal Tap and other films like that from the 1980s and 90s, which brought a group of actors through the history of racist imagery and asked people to question, like, whose history is this? Next. And for myself, as Sheree mentioned, and as Rebecca mentioned, my first book was on Kara Walker. And this is a piece of hers on the right from the Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, which was a group of lithographs that she did in 2005, around the same time as Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of Katrina, going into the archives, it kind of a pre-made archival collection of the pictorial history of the Civil War that was published by Harper's Weekly magazine in the years following the Civil War during the period that we call Reconstruction. Walker had been really interested in archival materials and has a massive, just like Michael Ray Charles has a massive collection of these really challenging images and objects. And when her work first became really visible in the mid 1990s, one of the people who pushed back against her was Betty Saar, another contemporary artist, but of an earlier generation, much more kind of generationally aligned with Camille Billups. And Saar's own work, such as this piece, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima from 1972, shows her interest in working with historical imagery, with kind of collectibles, advertising imagery, as a way to create a kind of sense of empowerment of of those objects, just as Michael Ray, shifts the power position in those crocodile Pickaninny images, objects. So too was Saar doing this, but Saar was very much in opposition to some of the work that Carol Walker was doing, because there was a sense there that generationally, folks who had grown up in the period following the civil rights movement had a very different relationship to these images, and really, I think this is something that Cherise, hopefully you'll agree with me on this. When I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, I saw very little of this material. I know that other people, may have grown up with it in their homes, but it was something that was, very much kind of banned from my from my purview, certainly from my household. It was really interesting. Just a few years ago, I was talking with a colleague, a white colleague here at the University of Pennsylvania, who had a massive collection of Mammy cookie jars that he had inherited from his mother. And he said to me, "Gwendolyn, what should I do with these cookie jars? I can't sell them. That would be, kind of wrong. Can I donate them? Could I donate them to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture?" And I was like, well, I'll see if I can help connect you with somebody. And I thought to myself, are these objects really like Black history, or are they white history? And I think this is a question that, increasingly we ask ourselves today. And I want to just share this screen. I hadn't intended to do so, but when Cherise was talking, I realized that I did want to bring in the work of Robert Arneson here, who is an artist, a Portuguese and Norwegian descended artist who died in the early 90s, but worked up in Northern California in Benicia, and was on the faculty at the University of California, Davis. And late in Arneson's life, he began to think about his relationship to racist imagery, because he was accused of having made very racist remarks to a Black colleague of his. And he began a whole series which engages some of the same images that Cherise showed, Michael Ray engaging. And this is a self-portrait of Arneson in this kind of blackface mask, which is based on that Coon Chicken Inn image. These are some ceramic busts of him that that also kind of share that, and you can see the way that he's kind of bringing out both his kind of natural white skin and then also the fake white skin of minstrelsy, along with the blackface, to emphasize the whiteness beneath that mask. And then these are three other pieces from 1990 that he did at this same time. And I think it raises this question, and if you could put the other presentation back up, Cherise, that would be great. Of who do these images belong to? Who made them? Whose history, are they really? Are they, are they Black history? Are they white history? And I can't. Oh, here we go. And then I just have one more slide, and then I'll hand it over to Tiffany. And this is some work that was just done last year by a Philadelphia-based artist, Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, aka Isis the Savior. And this is a series of works that she calls the Consecration of Mary, where she's gone into the archives, in this case, the archives of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the country's oldest art school, and taken a photograph that was readily available on their website up until a few months ago, a photograph of a young Black girl nude reclining on a sofa that was taken by Thomas Eakins, the very important, especially to Philadelphia, famous American painter from the 19th century, also photographer. And when Baxter encountered this image on the website, she was really devastated by it. As a survivor of childhood sexual abuse herself, she was re-traumatized by seeing this young Black girl, expose child pornography on a museum website, and that it was easily, accessible and downloadable, and that it was very different from some of the images of white children, nude white children that that Akins had also taken. And so Baxter inserts herself into the picture, and she rephotographs it and makes herself into a figure of protection for this girl, pulling this drape to cover her, allowing her to curl back into her arms and staring very directly out at us, questioning, how do these images still exist? How do they still circulate? How is it that I can stumble upon them on a museum website? And what should we do about it? And Baxter has become very radical in this regard, and is currently mounting a campaign to address these issues in a really systematic way throughout Philadelphia. So I think these are some of the questions that I'm most interested in, like whose images are they? Who do they belong to? How do we address them coming from different subject positions? And where do we go from here? So I'll give it to Tiffany now.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. Hi. I have a little bit of noise in the background, sorry, but I just wanted to start my presentation kind of picking up on some threads that Cherise and Gwendolyn laid out in their presentations. Next slide, please. This is some images of work that I included in an exhibition that I curated 6 years ago now at the Delaware Art Museum, that was taken from the African-American art collection that exists at the University of Delaware, where I'm now employed. And so we have prints from Michael Ray Charles, and next slide, please, Camille Billups. There was also a sculpture, and the emphasis, or the kind of concept behind the show, was looking at artworks made by artists of African descent that were reclaiming or revising or remixing racist imagery and memorabilia. Next slide, please. And this is an image, this is a painting by Peter Williams, who is another artist who kind of fits in the camp of making his own, maybe not his own archive, but making a kind of amassing a collection of these contemptible, these objects that Cherise has coined. And so this is a painting that's an outline of a tin toy mammy, which you see on the right side. But he's also thinking about disability and the kind of, again, kind of popular culture and kind of more unexpected characters that also have a relationship to racist caricature, such as Felix the Cat. And so I was really interested in that exhibition, thinking about this kind of flashpoint of the 90s and the turn of the 21st century, having so many artists of African descent kind of preoccupied by this imagery and these objects, and what that meant in terms of progress and empowerment at the turn of the 21st century, where we've got, multiculturalism and all these other kinds of discourses around reparations and post-Blackness, and that were beyond certain concepts or stigmas of race, gender, sexuality, the mainstreaming of intersectionality as a term. And so that's really kind of what I'm thinking about in my current work as well. Next slide, please. And thinking about a genealogy of artists of African descent who have continued to think about archives and collections, but also kind of rethink and give us new questions to ask of archives and collections. And so this is Zavaria Simmons, who was trained as a fine art photographer as well as in fashion photography, but she also studied acting and directing. And she really pulls from the archive, or the archive of American art and the Western art historical canon. And many of the poses and characters and settings that she stages and performs in her photographs and her other works are taken from extant artworks that have been considered kind of master works, photographs, paintings that have been considered master works within Western art history. And so here you see her kind of reperforming the role of photographer, or playing photographer in the way that Ansel Adams was playing, and kind of making these heroic portraits of himself with this, large format camera. And she's doing something similar, but obviously as a Black woman, very different than a white male photographer. Next slide, please. And here she also is kind of riffing on Botticelli's The Birth of the Venus. You see that she's also kind of introducing blackface imagery into this image, along with, red lips and a woolly afro wig, and really kind of questioning these, how The Birth of Venus has become a kind of standard of beauty, and thinking about not only Blackness, but also whiteness, right? And thinking about the nude as a trope within art history as well, and what figures get to occupy that space of the kind of like muse, or the nude, or the goddess. And so next slide, please. I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is another one of her kind of blackface images. And the landscape home, which you just saw in the last slide, and this One Day and Back Then, Seated, were not produced at the same time, but I think of them as kind of these loosely related images because of how she shows up in the photographs. She does not consider her work self-portraits, and so that's a really important distinction. And so in that way, she's kind of continuing a genealogy or trajectory implemented by artists, feminists, particularly feminist artists like Cindy Sherman, even Carrie Mae Weems. But she's doing something, I think, very different in terms of kind of intervening into landscape photography in particular. And here, this image, I love this image because it really takes us, we've been kind of talking about the archival impulse within contemporary Black art within a very US context. And this image, for me, kind of takes us into a more diasporic context, not only with how Blackface kind of operates within the broader diaspora, from the Netherlands to Sweden to and elsewhere, the Caribbean even, but also thinking about the wicker chair and kind of, again, kind of expanding what we think of as archive. And so bringing us into more kind of popular visual as well as material culture, and the way that this wicker chair has kind of been a symbol of defiance and protest in the Black world from the 1960s to present. You see on the right side, the wicker chair kind of became this emblem in a photograph of Huey P. Newton that was taken or staged by Eldridge Cleaver, but was taken by Blair Stapp around 1966, 1967. And that became the poster for the Free Huey campaign once Huey P. Newton was incarcerated and falsely accused of murdering a cop. And so this wicker chair also shows up in, I don't have a slide of it, but the I Am Queen Mary sculpture, public sculpture that has since been reimagined as a virtual reality experience in Copenhagen, made by two Black women artists who have ties to the colonies and either in the Netherlands, in the metropole, but also in St. Croix. And so this thinking about, again, kind of material culture and popular culture as an archive for intervention. Next slide, please. And kind of continuing on that thread of material culture, the last slide that I have is of Narcissister, kind of turning herself into a topsy-turvy doll. She's a performance artist who has a dance background. And so I wanted to show this because she's really thinking about kind of going back to what Gwendolyn was saying about James Hatch and Camille Billups, and thinking about also what Zavaria Simmons is doing in terms of the contrast between whiteness and Blackness. Narcissister is a mixed race artist and who really traffics in what I call kind of self-objectification and race play, turning herself into a topsy-turvy doll. She's performs acrobatics and really raises the question of what are the right and wrong ways to picture and perform Blackness, which is a main question that I'm thinking about in my current project. And so she also kind of moves the question of the archive not just to material culture, but to beyond, to the body and beyond. And she's thinking about images and repertoires in Black concert dance. She trained at the at the Ailey School, which is the official school for the Alvin Ailey American Dance Company based in New York City. She trained there in the 1990s. And so she really uses her body as a container. She literally stores things inside of her body in different orifices, and will perform a reverse striptease and kind of adorn her body with materials that she's been holding inside of different cavities. But she also thinks about the body as a container of memory, and particularly thinking about Alvin Ailey's own kind of assertion about his work as a manifestation of blood memories of him growing up in the South and really trying to think about and stage Black experience in dance on the concert stage from the 1950s onward. And so Narcissus Sister is a generationally thinking about different things and kind of departing from these aspirational narratives that Ailey explored in his own work, and really pointing us toward a different kind of ethics of representation, and expanding what counts as archival practice. And so I think I will end there. I think that gives us about 15 minutes for questions. So yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, I was on mute. Apologies for that. So at this point, I would like to just kind of remind everyone that there are lots and lots of artists that are dealing with archival materials in various ways, shapes, and forms. And let me just name a few of them. There's Gala Porras Kim, who is also a scholar at the Research Institute with us this year, Ken Gonzalez Day, Sadie Barnett, Lava Thomas, Kenyatta Hinkle, among many, many, many others. And I would draw people's attention to the Okwin Wazer book and exhibition Archive Fever to think about these ideas a bit more carefully and in a different moment than we're currently in. But at this point, maybe we should think about some questions and or topics, or Rebecca, should we go to Q&A?
Yes, thank you, Cherise. And thank you, all three of our speakers, Cherise, Gwendolyn, and Tiffany, for sharing your work with us and for giving us three really rich ways of thinking about artists and archives and the creative work that emerges at the intersection. So yes, this is the time when we can turn to Q&A with our audience. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I just want to take advantage of this moment to ask a question that I've been thinking about that's been on my mind. I've been thinking a lot about how scholars are sometimes in the position to engage with archives in creative ways themselves. In particular, I'm thinking about the potential of oral histories to address archives, to acknowledge where they are incomplete, and to generate new knowledge to contribute to existing archives. And I just love to hear your thoughts about how the scholarly and creative potential of scholarly work engaging in archives in ways that both reflect on the archives that exist and have the potential to create new archives to augment them.
I can start answering that question, colleagues, friends. So right now I am in the Getty's archives. I want to say the Research Institute's archives, but it's in fact the institutional archives of all of the Getty that I am researching for the Carrie Mae Weems project. And it is an exercise in both creativity in thinking through how and where to find the materials that I'm looking for, because they are not fully integrated yet into special collections, because they're a record of the institution's work and not an archive for scholars, for example. And so it has been, as I said, just an exercise in creativity to think through logical steps, people who knew one another, people who did particular kinds of work. And then when certain dead ends were reached, then oral histories I've had to undertake, for example, of past curators, past gallerists, including the artists on whom I'm working. So it is a really creative set of strategies that a scholar needs to have and to use to engage in order to write these kinds of histories. Gwendolyn or Tiffany, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add to that. I sit on the advisory board for the Historic Artists Homes and Studios initiative, which is part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And out of the dozens of artist homes and studios that are preserved, there is only one presently that is of an African-American artist. The rest, about 40 of them, are white artists' homes. And, and this is one of the biggest issues, I think, going forward, is how to preserve the archives of Black artists, the materials in their studios, how to be able to get in there immediately, as people, whether they know they're going to pass or if they've recently passed, and work with families to preserve these materials. There's an exhibition right now that's at the Baltimore Museum of Art of an artist, Richard Yard, who I knew for most of my life, and I was lucky enough in 2011 to do an oral history interview with him that I stored in a file on my desktop for about 10 years. And when I found out that the Baltimore Museum of Art was doing this exhibition, they transcribed it, and I wrote an extended essay using that conversation as a part of my writing. And through that conversation and through the other work that the curator Oliver Schell did, we were able to find some of the materials, the source material that Yard was working with, and try to reconstruct some of the the images that he was drawing on. And so in the exhibition, which is just up for a couple of more weeks, there are some of those images that he worked with. Some of them are Vanderzee photographs from the from the 1920s and 30s, and I think that it really speaks to the impact that Black visual culture, early visual culture, that for artists of Richard's generation, who was born in the 1930s, we're kind of getting in little bits and pieces. There was this recent exhibition that Hilton Owls did of the Black Book, of Toni Morrison's Black Book, which was this massive archival project that Morrison did while she was an editor, before she started publishing her own, novels, et cetera. And, this book was really pivotal for a lot of Black artists who were working in the 1970s and 80s, to show the history of enslavement and to show some of the really brutal imagery. And if we don't go in and, work with artists, living artists, to help them plan and preserve, it's going to be really hard. It will be continually difficult for younger generations of scholars, as it has been for our generation. Tiffany's a little younger than Cherise and I, but to do this work, it's so much work when you have to kind of start from scratch and and reconstruct.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly that in terms of oral history as a part of the art historian's toolkit, as Sheree talked about earlier this week in her other talk for the Getty Research Institute, I think that oral histories kind of are a way to fill in the gap and address some of the limits that archives or collections or even canonical scholarship or even methods kind of either miss or reproduce reproduce these kind of absences and gaps. And so one of the things that I do in my own work which has to do with having been a curator first before I became an art historian, is I'm constantly in artist studios and having conversations with artists, very much like what Gwendolyn was talking about, and just kind of documenting the conversations that I'm having with artists as they're thinking through and solving problems in their studios. And all of those things you can't necessarily capture in object analysis. You can get at some of those questions, but so just, I think that studio visits and oral histories are incredibly important, and just a part of the art historian's toolkit that becomes a kind of way to not only correct certain mistakes or misinterpretations within the scholarly record. I'm thinking particularly of an essay that I wrote for the recent or the current traveling exhibition on Alma Thomas, and there was a photograph in the not in particular to my essay, but in the catalog itself that was not the photographer wasn't credited. The photographer is John Simmons. He's still alive. He's right here in LA, right? And so, but because of oral histories and people, having these kind of more informal networks of people, of folks, scholars, collectors, enthusiasts interested in African American art history, we were able to actually identify and correct that oversight within the catalog for the reprint. So those kinds of things I'm thinking about too.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in from our audience, so I will start relaying those. But first, I've been asked to remind anybody who has raised their hand to please type your question directly into the Q&A box, because our AV team is not going to be unmuting the audience. We'll be fielding questions through the Q&A. So turning to our first question, one of our participants writes, I feel like Black history does not exist without white history, particularly when it comes to oppression. Are the terms Black and white history outdated?
Dr. Childs, yes, absolutely. They are outdated. We need to just be saying history because it's all of our history. But let my colleagues respond to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's challenging though, as somebody who's been teaching African American art history for, 20 plus years now. If I teach a class called African American art history, like the Black students on campus can find me. If I teach American art history and I put lots of Black stuff in there, they can't. So it's this real catch-22 because we're so conditioned to think that we can only find Blackness if it's written across the top of the label. Otherwise, because of the exclusionary practices of American art history for so long, it's, people just assume that it's not going to include, a prominent integrated narrative, of any sort. So I think this is a challenge that, I feel really acutely, having tried to, for, decades, to mainstream, everything that I was doing, to believe that it was mainstream, and now to realize that it's still a challenge, and that maybe I have to go back, to teaching classes that are labeled really specifically. The same thing with book titles for books. I think in all of the books that people write about African American art, Black art, you got to put that in the title, otherwise people will not imagine that could be the case.
This is such a great question, Dr. Childs. Thank you so much for this. Something that I think about with my students and in my own work is how Blackness and I don't want to say non-Blackness. I don't want to say whiteness either, because I think it's more complex than that. But are in a kind of antagonistic relationship, and there's an unbridgeable distance there that we have to contend with on a regular basis in our daily lives, and we're all circumscribed by it, regardless of our racial identities. And so something that I think about with my students is trying to get more specific terms rather than just Black history and white history, actually thinking about structurally what's happening and like materially condition-wise on the ground in our daily lives, what's happening and how that gets infused into or plays out in representation more broadly, but also in terms of art making and the art world and the art market, right? And so thank you for that question. It's definitely something that I think about on a regular basis.
Another question from Josh Franco. I would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on place and archives. For instance, do you know of instances where Black artists or art historians, critics, or other record creators are faced with deciding if their papers will stay in their home region or go to more nationally or globally framed repositories? What are the considerations in these instances?
Can I start? I think this is a really, really critical question. It can be challenging to let go of an archive and feel like it's going into, the hands of a mega institution that maybe has not always had the best record of caring for objects from the Black community. And I've seen this with not just with Artist Archive, but with archives of Black women's organizations in particular. Thinking about, well, do we keep this archive ourselves? Do we place it? And here I'm thinking of the Women's League for Community Service in Boston, Massachusetts, which had to decide, do we keep these archives? Do we place them with the Radcliffe Institute, which is focused on women's history? Do we put them with the Boston Public Library? And I think that sometimes, it comes down to the decision of like, where will these things be found? Right. If you look at the Hatch Phillips archives, they're in 3 different locations. Emory University has a massive chunk of them. Indiana University has the film archives. The New York Public Library has some of the theater things, and the Library of Congress has a bunch of oral histories. And so they're really spread out. And I think that that's in some ways a really great strategy, because it draws institutions, together. It creates networks, of exchange.
Can I just add here that I think this is a really important question, thinking through what it means to integrate predominantly wider PWI institutions and archives versus adding certain archival materials to quote unquote ethnically specific or identity specific institutions. So at the University of Texas at Austin, I am part of an initiative to both integrate the collections like the humanities, the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Centers, the HRC, the Benton Libraries, which are Latin American studies, for example, but also to have our own collections, because it's important to do both, to integrate collections, but also to have them amassed together where there's some sense of the kind of intellectual context and density, right? Not just a single artist of color in a kind of white ocean of other archival materials or collections, but to have some density of experience there.
I think, and I'm gonna jump ahead because I'm looking at the chat or the Q&A, and I wanted to connect 2 things: Josh's question with Uchenna's question about the importance of HBCUs versus these kind of more mega institutions, or even just like smaller university museums as a collecting space. Because I'm thinking particularly about the university museums at the University of Delaware. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the exhibition that I curated called Dark Humor came from the African American Art Collection at the University of Delaware, which I didn't even know about. I didn't really know about it before I got that curatorial fellowship to do that project. And that collection was started by Paul R. Jones, who was just like a Black middle class, I think he might have been like a lawyer or something, who was really interested in supporting artists of African descent from the 1960s onward, and didn't really have a lot of money, and started collecting prints and going and building relationships with artists and going to their studios and buying artwork out of their studios. And so there's an overabundance of prints in the collection because of that, and because they were collectible and they're multiples and they were affordable. And so his collection is split between the University of Alabama and the University of Delaware. These are not major, quote unquote, like we don't think of these as major institutions per se, but they have an incredible kind of trove of artworks. And a lot of the records are also sadly not that great because Paul was just like collecting and having a good time and hanging out with his friends. But the records are even, I mean, some of the artists aren't identified. We don't have a lot of information about them and where they are now. Are they still living? Or like what was their trajectory? And so to Uchenna's kind of point and about HBCUs, that's another thing, is like thinking about resource and access. This is really a question of resource and access and equity. And so I just wanted to put that on the table, and I don't know if my colleagues have responses, but.
Mostly that I wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you. I want to just quickly acknowledge that we're on the hour. So if anybody needs to leave, thank you very much for joining us. But for anybody who can stay, we will continue on because we have a number of other really rich questions waiting for our attention. Turning to our next question from Sarah Collins, how does performance emerge with these artists' engagement with the archive or in your research and thinking about these genealogies?
Tiffany, I think you should take that question.
I knew you were going to do that. I'm not sure how to answer this question. And maybe it's just because I'm thinking in terms of phrasing. So let me look at it again. How does performance emerge with these artists' engagement with the archive? Well, in terms of my own research, I have a dance background. And so I actually came to art history kind of through this backdoor way of dance and then curatorial practice, and then kind of stumbled into art history that way because I saw a real opportunity to support artists of African descent who still, I think this is still a problem, like in terms of gallery representation, museum culture. They're really still very much disenfranchised, even though it appears as if, I think it appears as if artists of African descent are doing quite well because the market tells us that they are being collected and their works are being auctioned at exponential numbers and things like this, right? But in fact, there are a number, I think the majority of artists of African descent, that at least the ones that I come in contact with, and I've been talking with another colleague about this, is like, in terms of navigating gallery representation, contracts, royalties, all of these things that contribute to the disenfranchisement that artists, that non-Black artists don't, that they have a longer history of navigating this because of, again, these kinds of questions or issues of access and equity. And so in terms of performance, in my own background, my approach to visual analysis is very much, I keep knocking over my laptop, sorry. Very much informed by my dance training and how I was taught to kind of look at a body that was performing and moving in space and have to replicate that. So these kinds of questions of like the copy versus the original, mimesis, all of these things that we think about in art history, dancer in the studio and on the concert stage. And so that's one part of, or one answer to the question. I'll have to think more about the first part of the question, but.
Other thoughts on performance in the archives?
I feel like I need to let that one sit. And Sarah is my student.
I'll turn to her.
Know Sarah from my graduate days at the University of Rochester. So I can also follow up with Sarah after this too.
Well, I will turn to our next question then, which came in two parts, so I'll combine them.
You know, can I say one thing now that I've thought about that for a second, and
Sure.
Maybe this will resonate with Cherise. You know, going back to the book, to the Michael Ray Charles book, you know, one of the things that happened in that conversation that Cherise and Michael Ray had at Smithsonian was a question I think I lobbed at them about performing, you know, as art historians, as artists, and you know, and how for you know, for so many of us, our work becomes about kind of performing our expertise, performing our engagement, performing our Blackness, performing, you know, a kind of credibility, and you know, and you know, having an authentic relationship to the objects, having a kind of possessive relationship over them, whereby, you know, we can talk about them because we have, you know, the history of, you know, blood, sweat, and tears that are attached to them, and that, you know, that is supposed to somehow like privilege our words, when in many ways, you know, as I said during my presentation, so much of this work for me was really alien, and it was you know, the contemptible collectible work was, you know, was something that I had to come to as a scholar. It wasn't something that you know, that came to me as a part of, you know, my upbringing and my daily life. It wasn't something that had been naturalized as a part of you know, of where I came to it.
Now that we're talking about this, I also had a thought that I don't know how far I could take this thought right now, but something that I'm thinking about in my own research at this point is the ways in which, especially artists who are trafficking in Blackface imagery, the suggestion or the kind of implication of that practice is, one implication is that performance is imminent to Blackness, right? And so I think that's something that you're also kind of pointing toward too in your own anecdotes, Gwendolyn. And so it's something that I don't have an answer for, and I'm not sure if it's something that can be resolved, but it is something that I'm thinking deeply about in my writing right now. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, as someone who also works in performance, super interested in the various identities that we are performing and reperforming all of the time. You know, professor, scholar, researcher, writer, among them, parent, partner, all of them. And how some of them involve performances of race, whether or not we want them to do that, but that they sometimes and often do. I guess the other way that I'm thinking about performance in this context is that in the archival work that I've been doing at the GRI, I'm having to imagine what it would have been like to see this exhibition in 1995 at a time when Weems is certainly really ascendant and rising and having great exhibitions at SF MoMA and at the Whitney, among other places. But she's not the artist that she is now, or rather, she is not the well-known artist that she has become. And so what does it mean to, you know, put yourself back in 1995 when she has a commission from a curator at a museum that does not think about African-American art at all, that's, you know, kind of resolutely not interested in, I'm talking about the Getty Villa pre-Getty Center, not interested in African-American art. And so to think through the stakes of, and this is all about, you know, performance studies, like imagining back into that 1990s moment when we're post-uprising, post-Rodney King, when the museum is attempting, as museums are now, to better integrate their audiences, to better integrate their exhibitions, but also knowing that the Getty at that point and today is a major collector of the history of photography and a kind of pusher, for lack of a better word, advocate for a certain kind of history of photography. And so that's one of the interesting things about this project, is that I think Weems is really seeing herself as intervening in the history of photography, especially the history that is being told by the Getty in the mid-1990s. So that's a way that performance studies absolutely is affecting this project, even if it's not a performance project.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. I'm going to combine two that have come in from the same attendee, Allison Jefferson. Thanks you for your insightful recentering of Blackness in art history presentations today, and would like to hear more about your ideas on Blackface imagery and its ownership, and in particular, how those images should be valued monetarily.
None of us is rushing to answer this question. I mean, that's a complicated one. I suppose one thing that the Michael Ray Charles, a retrospective book does is to historicize the collecting of contemptible collectibles, Black memorabilia, that happened in the 80s and the 1990s. And there's a couple of high profile collections that begin to happen. And then people like Marlon Briggs both make documentaries about the stereotypes and about the objects that come from the stereotypes. And then, of course, there are people like Oprah and Spike Lee and Charles, among others, who begin to collect the objects. So, on the one hand, they have financial value, right? And there's even a museum that's dedicated to, the Jim Crow imagery in Michigan. It's hard. It's really a hard thing to say how they should be valued. I mean, they are historically valuable because they're objects that happened and they existed and they continue to exist. Valuing them financially because of their rarity, I'm not sure what to say about that. It's a good question, Allison.
I had some strange moments in terms of my engagement with these objects as things that could be purchased over the years. And remember at one moment I thought, well, if I'm writing about this material, I should own some of it and maybe I should start collecting it. And and when you go into an antique shop and you see things, I remember visiting St. Louis, Missouri in the mid-90s and finding a salt and pepper shaker, of a Black man and a Black woman. And I'm like, oh, $30. I have $30. I could spend $30 on this. And, and I did, and I had them on my bookshelf in my apartment when I was a faculty, we called them faculty masters back then. Now they're called faculty directors at my university because master has a bad connotation. But I sort of felt like, as soon as like a Black woman became a faculty master, then like they, took the title away. But I had them on my shelf and students would come into my apartment and they would see some of these objects. And some students were absolutely traumatized, and they couldn't understand why I had these, why I was displaying them. And I said, well, this is really important for history. But I also felt like, well, maybe I don't have to share that history with these kids when they're coming in my apartment. Maybe like, it's one thing to have them in my study for research purposes, another thing to like display them as, as though they're, art objects. And like that colleague that I mentioned earlier, who had this massive collection of cookie jars. And when I reached out to colleagues at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I said, I have this colleague who has like 50 of these jars. Do you guys want them? They're like, no. Have so much of that stuff. Like, we don't need any more of it. There's no way that there's going to be anything in there that we haven't seen and that we need to have in this collection. And that's a big dilemma, right? Because if Smithsonian doesn't feel like the nation's attic has any more space for this stuff, right? And it's on the shelves at at antique dealers. One time I went and I got a postcard of it was a whipping image, Delaware. It was like the Delaware whipping post image. And I was negotiating with this antique dealer for it. And when I got it home, I realized that I had overpaid for it by like 80%. I spent $100 on it and it was like worth $20. And I'm like, that jerk exploited my Black desire for this object, and made money off and I was so angry about that I haven't bought anything since, because I felt like it's just too complicated and I don't really, I can access that stuff online. I don't really need to own it. I don't need to own anymore for my research purposes anyway. And I don't display it in my living room anymore either.
I think on the question of ownership, I mean, it's a fact. It is like, Cherise and Gwendolyn are saying, it's a very complicated question. And I think that just as much as anti-Blackness kind of, well, in my view, circumscribes, our social relations, I also think that these objects, this history of exchange is also a shared historical memory. And so I'm not sure ownership is, I don't know if ownership is I'm having a problem with that term. So I'll have to think more about that, Allison, and we can talk offline about this. But the other thing I wanted to share was also that in the slides that I showed of Peter Williams and kind of being an artist that also has a collection of these of this kind of African Americana, in a nice way to put it, but these contemptible collectibles. I remember cleaning out my grandmother's house. Peter Williams is sadly no longer living, but I remember one of the conversations that he and I had in his studio a few years ago was my grandmother had just died, and my mom and I had cleaned out her house, and she had these. I had never seen these before. I mean, my grandmother lived in this house for 60 years, and I'd never seen these shot glasses of like minstrel characters on them, and I was like, what? I just didn't know that she even kept those things. And it was very strange to me. And then, so I ended up gifting them to Peter because I knew that he had a collection and he actually already had a set of these, or maybe he didn't have a set of the shot glasses, but then I was out walking through an exhibition that I can't remember now because it's been a few years, and of course COVID brain, but these exact shot glasses were in a display case, like a vitrine in this exhibition, and I was just like, this is, so I just to say that it's complicated, it's layered. I'm not sure if ownership is the word that resonates with me, but yeah, anyway, just wanted to put that on the table too.
Thank you. Since we're down to our last question, I want to bring two out at the same time because they approach a similar issue from different perspectives, and we might be able to say something productive about both of them at once. So Dahyang Jiang writes, thank you so much for your rich presentations. My question is this: is it possible that these archival practices constituted an institutional critique? That is to say, a critique of institutions in possession of archival materials and responsible for the production of knowledge. And then alongside that question, Charles Clark III asks, what are the panelists' thoughts on how Black artists' reuse of archival materials do the work of subverting the encyclopedic impulse to separate and catalog the Black experience?
So I can say for myself that I have argued that this is institutional critique, absolutely. And I know that my colleagues have made similar arguments. It is still an interesting and challenging practice. Yeah, even if it is institutional critique. Anyone else want to start an answer or hazard an answer?
I'm in full agreement. I know that something that we wanted to talk about too was like appropriation and citational practice, and we didn't get there, which is fine. Again, Dahyang, we can also have this conversation offline. But I absolutely agree that this is part of a larger tradition of institutional critique, which I think in terms of the flashpoint in the 90s that we've been kind of circling around in each of our presentations, like institutional critique was concurrent with this phenomenon as well, right? Like 1980s, 90s kind of identity politics into institutional critique. So I think that, yeah, there's definitely a kind of genealogical relationship there.
And there's a way, you know, Tiffany, when you say that, it makes me think there's a way that a lot of these artists who, you know, are just a little bit later than, you know, what you might call the pictures generation. Like in a lot of ways, this is the pictures generation done Black, right? That, you know, engaging this material is, you know, is a really similar impulse. And a lot of these artists are, you know, the same generation or like just a little bit younger. So there you go. And then the older ones too, right? You know.
Yeah, some of us are trying to quickly write those histories surrounding pictures and Black people. And I'm one of those people.
This is a conversation that could and should continue, and I hope it does offline and in subsequent iterations online as well. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you especially to our speakers for sharing your work with us and raising so many important issues, and to our audience. And I will look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.